Two women mocked a single mom and an autistic man in a grocery store, their cruelty loud enough for a 4-year-old to hear. What happened next made those same women cry in front of everyone and changed lives forever. When you see someone being humiliated in public, would you stay silent or risk everything to speak up? The fluorescent lights above aisle 7 buzzed with that same tired hum Claire had learned to ignore. But today it felt louder, like everything inside the store was watching her count pennies. She stood at the cereal shelf with her cart half full of store-brand everything, her daughter Mia tugging at her worn jacket sleeve, asking in that sweet 4-year-old whisper if they could get the box with the cartoon rabbit on it. Claire didn't answer right away because she was doing the math again in her head. The same math she'd done 3 times already that morning, trying to stretch $32 across 4 more days until her paycheck cleared, and the rabbit cereal cost $2 more than the generic kind that tasted like cardboard, but kept Mia fed. She reached for the plain box, the one without cartoon characters or bright colors, and felt Mia's hand go still against her leg, that little silence children make when they understand disappointment, even if they can't name it yet. Claire's throat tightened the way it always did when she had to choose between what her daughter wanted and what they could afford, a choice that felt like failing, even when it was just surviving. She put the generic box in the cart and kept moving, kept her eyes down, kept pretending she didn't notice the woman in the cashmere coat 2 feet away, staring at the contents of her cart like it was evidence of something shameful. Mia clutched her stuffed rabbit closer, the one with the missing eye and the ear that had been sewn back on twice, and Claire felt a flash of gratitude that her daughter still found comfort in things that were broken and repaired. The store felt too bright suddenly, too crowded, everyone moving with that Tuesday morning efficiency, while Claire moved slower, checking her list, rechecking prices, aware of every single item she touched, and whether it would push her over the invisible line she'd drawn in her budget. She turned the corner toward the dairy section, and her cart bumped into someone else's, metal clanging against metal in a sound that made 3 nearby shoppers look up at once. "I'm so sorry," Claire said immediately, her voice coming out smaller than she wanted it to, and when she looked up, she saw a man about her age, maybe 35, maybe younger, with careful eyes that didn't quite meet hers, but didn't look angry either. He stood very still for a moment, his hands gripping his cart with a particular kind of precision, fingers lined up evenly on the handle. And then he said, "It's okay," in a voice so gentle it made her chest hurt for reasons she couldn't explain. There was something in the way he stood, the way he paused before speaking, the way his eyes focused somewhere just past her left shoulder, that made Claire think of her younger brother before he died, the one who used to organize his books by color and hated when people touched his things without asking. The man smiled at Mia, a real smile that reached his eyes, even though he still wasn't looking directly at either of them, and Mia waved her rabbit at him in that fearless way children have before the world teaches them to be cautious. Claire felt herself relax slightly, felt some of the morning's tension ease from her shoulders, and she was about to say something else. Maybe thank you or sorry again, when she heard the whisper from behind her, sharp and deliberate as a slap. "Look at her cart, everything generic, can't even afford real cereal for that kid," came a woman's voice, not quite quiet enough to be private, not quite loud enough to be confrontation, existing in that cruel middle space designed to humiliate without consequence. Claire's face went hot, and her hands tightened on the cart handle, every muscle in her body suddenly aware of being watched, being judged, being found insufficient by strangers who knew nothing about the 3 jobs she'd worked last year, or the hospital bills still coming in, or the father who'd left before Mia learned to walk. She didn't turn around because turning around would mean acknowledging the comment, would mean giving the whisper the power to become a conversation. So instead she focused on the man in front of her, who was now looking at something on the shelf with intense concentration, and she wondered if he'd heard it too. Mia's hand found hers and squeezed, that instinctive gesture children make when they sense their parents' distress, and Claire squeezed back, trying to communicate safety even though she felt anything but safe in that moment. The whispering continued behind her, joined now by a second voice, both women speaking in that specific tone people use when they want to be overheard but maintain plausible deniability, and Claire caught fragments, single mother. Probably on assistance, they let anyone shop here now. She felt her vision narrow the way it did when panic started creeping in, that tunnel vision that made the bright store feel suddenly darker, more confined, and she told herself to just keep moving, just finish shopping, just get through the next 10 minutes without falling apart in public. But her feet wouldn't move, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking, and she realized with a horrible certainty that she was about to cry right there in aisle 7, surrounded by cereal and strangers, and her daughter, who deserved so much better than this. The man with the careful eyes was still standing there, and Claire noticed he'd gone very still again, that same precise stillness from before, and she wondered if he was uncomfortable, if her presence and her generic cart and her whispered about poverty were making him want to leave. She was about to apologize again, about to move her cart out of his way, when she saw his hands were trembling slightly where they gripped the metal handle, and she realized with a jolt that maybe he'd heard everything too. Maybe he was dealing with his own calculations about whether to stay or go, whether to acknowledge the cruelty or pretend it wasn't happening. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, and someone's phone rang 3 aisles over, and Mia said, "Mama!" in a small voice that meant she knew something was wrong, even if she didn't understand what. Claire made herself breathe, made herself think about anything except the women behind her, who were still talking, their voices growing bolder now. And she focused instead on the man's cart, which held exactly 12 items, all arranged in a specific pattern she couldn't quite decipher, but recognized as intentional. There was something oddly comforting about that precision, about someone else in this chaotic store, moving through the world with their own set of rules and systems, and she found herself wanting to ask him something, anything, just to create a moment of human connection that wasn't built on judgment or shame. But before she could speak, one of the women behind her said something else, something Claire didn't quite catch, but heard the tone of clearly that particular blend of disgust and amusement people use when they think cruelty is entertainment. The man's head tilted slightly, a barely perceptible movement, and for the first time since their carts collided, he looked almost directly at Claire, his eyes landing somewhere near her chin, and she saw something in his expression shift from careful neutrality to something else, something that looked like recognition or maybe solidarity. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, and Claire realized they were both standing there frozen in the middle of the dairy section, 2 strangers connected by nothing except the shared experience of being reduced to whispered commentary by people who had never struggled to count pennies in a grocery store. The moment stretched out, uncomfortable and electric, and Claire thought about all the times she'd stayed silent when she should have spoken, all the small cruelties she'd witnessed and walked past, and she wondered if this was one of those moments that would define what kind of person she was becoming in the face of everything falling apart. Mia tugged on her jacket again and said, "Mama, why are those ladies being mean?" in a voice loud enough to carry, loud enough to turn heads, and Claire felt her daughter's words land in the space between them like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward with truth. Children speak before they learn to soften it. The whispering stopped just for a second, and in that second, Claire made a choice not to shush her daughter, not to teach her that cruelty should be absorbed in silence, and she looked down at Mia's upturned face and said, "I don't know, baby," because it was the only honest answer she had. The man with the careful eyes was looking at them both now, really looking, and Claire saw his jaw tighten with some decision he was making, and she had the strangest feeling that whatever happened next would matter in ways she couldn't predict yet. The store felt different suddenly, the air charged with potential energy, and Claire noticed other shoppers slowing down, pretending to examine products while clearly listening to whatever drama was unfolding in aisle 7. She wanted to disappear, wanted to abandon her cart and take Mia's hand and walk out into the parking lot where the morning sun was probably still shining on a world that didn't care about generic cereal or whispered judgments. But her feet stayed planted because something in her refused to run this time, refused to let her daughter see her mother choose invisibility over dignity one more time. The man's cart creaked slightly as he shifted his weight, and Claire realized they were both waiting for something, both standing at the edge of a moment that could go a dozen different directions, and she thought about courage and what it cost, and whether she had any left after everything this year had already taken from her. What would you do if someone defended you when you'd stopped defending yourself? Drop your answer in the comments below. The man moved first, stepping slightly to the side so his cart blocked the aisle behind Claire, creating a physical barrier between her and the whispers that had gone quiet but not silent. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there with that same precise posture, and Claire noticed his breathing had changed, become more deliberate, like he was counting inhales and exhales the way she sometimes counted money. His eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the dairy case, and he said, "Excuse me," in a voice that carried further than she expected, clear and steady despite the tremor still visible in his hands. The two women behind them stopped mid-sentence, their conversations severed by the interruption, and Claire heard one of them make a small scoffing sound that might have been amusement or irritation. She couldn't bring herself to turn around, couldn't bear to see their faces, so instead she watched the man's profile as he continued speaking, each word chosen with care. "I heard what you said about her," he told them, still not making eye contact with anyone, his gaze trained on that invisible point in the middle distance that seemed to anchor him. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs because nobody had defended her in so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand between her and cruelty. And she wanted to tell him it was okay. He didn't have to do this, but her throat had closed around all the words she might have said. Mia pressed closer against her leg, rabbit clutched tight, and Claire felt her daughter's small body radiating confusion and fear in equal measure. The store around them had gone eerily quiet, other shoppers abandoning any pretense of minding their own business, and Claire realized they'd become the morning's entertainment whether she wanted it or not. "I don't think we were talking to you," one of the women said, her voice dripping with condescension that Claire recognized from 1,000 small interactions, job interviews, parent-teacher conferences, anywhere people decided she didn't belong. The man's jaw tightened, but he didn't move, didn't turn toward the voice, just kept staring at that same fixed point, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "You were talking about her loudly enough for everyone to hear," he said, and there was something in his tone now, not anger exactly, but something firmer, something that suggested he understood exactly what they'd been doing. Claire saw one of the women finally, caught her reflection in the glass door of the dairy case, middle-aged, with expensive highlights and an expression that looked perpetually disappointed with the world around her. The woman took a step closer, invading the small bubble of space the man had created, and said, "Are you her boyfriend or something? Her protector?" With a laugh that made Claire's stomach turn. The man's hands gripped his cart tighter, knuckles going white, and he said, "No, I'm a stranger who shops here every Tuesday, and I've never seen you be kind to anyone." The words landed like stones, each one weighted with observation Claire hadn't expected, and she realized he'd been watching these women too, had probably witnessed their cruelty directed at others on different Tuesday mornings. The second woman spoke up now, her voice sharper, more defensive. "We were just commenting on the state of things, how some people make choices that affect their children. It's not our fault if she can't provide properly." Claire felt the accusation like a physical blow, felt every sacrifice she'd made dissolve into evidence of her inadequacy, and she wanted to scream that she was providing, that she worked 50 hours a week, that Mia was fed and clothed and loved beyond measure. But the man spoke before she could, his voice still steady, despite the way his whole body had started to tremble now. "I'm autistic," he said, and the word dropped into the space between them like a confession and a challenge simultaneously, changing the energy in the aisle instantly. Claire's breath caught because she understood suddenly why his movements were so precise, why he didn't make eye contact, why he seemed to be fighting some invisible current just to stand there and speak. "People comment on the state of things about me too, about how I move, how I talk, whether I belong in public spaces with normal people." The first woman's expression shifted, not quite to embarrassment, but something close. Awareness, maybe, that she'd miscalculated the situation. "That's different," she said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction, sounded hollow in the fluorescent-lit space. The man shook his head slowly, still not looking at her. "It's not different at all. You're deciding we don't measure up to some standard you've invented, and you think saying it quietly makes it acceptable." Claire wanted to touch his arm, wanted to thank him, wanted to tell him he didn't have to keep going. But she stayed frozen, watching this stranger dismantle cruelty with nothing but honesty. "She's doing her best," the man continued, and now he gestured slightly toward Claire without looking at her directly. "And her daughter is clean and happy and holding a toy she clearly loves, which means someone is teaching her what matters." Claire felt tears burning behind her eyes because he'd seen Mia's rabbit, had noticed the care in the imperfect repairs, had understood in seconds what the women behind them refused to see. The second woman made a dismissive sound and said, "You don't know anything about us or what we—" But the man interrupted her. Something Claire sensed was difficult for him, breaking his own patterns to speak over someone else. "I know you've been here for 12 minutes and haven't said one kind word to anyone," he told them, his voice starting to shake now but pushing through it. "I know the employee you asked for help. You didn't say please or thank you. I know you left your cart in the middle of the aisle 3 times, making other people move around you." The specificity of his observations was startling, evidence that he'd been cataloguing their behavior with the same precision he brought to arranging items in his cart. And Claire saw the women exchange glances that suggested they hadn't expected to be watched, hadn't considered themselves visible in the same way they'd made others visible. An elderly man, stocking shelves 2 aisles over, had stopped working, was standing there openly watching now, and Claire caught his eye for half a second before looking away. The fluorescent lights buzzed, and somewhere in the distance a child was crying, and the whole mundane machinery of the grocery store kept turning while this small confrontation unfolded in the dairy section. The first woman's face had gone red, not with shame but with anger, and she said, "I don't have to stand here and be lectured by—" And she stopped herself. But the unsaid word hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Claire didn't want to examine too closely. The man's breathing had become audible now, short and controlled, and Claire recognized the signs of someone approaching their limit, someone who'd pushed past their comfort zone and was paying the price for it in ways the women probably couldn't see. Mia said, "That man is nice, Mama," in her clear child's voice, cutting through the tension with simple truth, and the second woman looked down at her with an expression Claire couldn't quite read. The man's hands were shaking badly now, still gripping the cart like it was the only solid thing in a tilting world, and he said one more thing, quiet but clear. "You should apologize to her." The first woman laughed. Actually laughed, a sound so sharp it made Claire flinch and pull Mia closer against her hip. "Apologize," the woman repeated, her voice climbing half an octave into theatrical disbelief, and Claire saw her glance at her companion as if checking they were witnessing the same absurdity. The man didn't respond, just stood there with his whole body rigid, waiting, and Claire realized he wasn't going to back down, even though the effort of holding his ground was clearly costing him something she couldn't measure. The second woman stepped forward, closing the distance between them until she was uncomfortably close to Claire. near enough that Claire could smell her perfume, something expensive and cloying that seemed designed to announce wealth. "Listen," the woman said in a tone people use when they're about to explain why they're actually the victim. "We weren't trying to be cruel. We were simply observing that certain lifestyle choices have consequences for children, and if you can't handle honest assessment, maybe you shouldn't be out in public." Claire felt the words rearrange themselves in her mind, the way cruelty always dressed itself up as concern, as honesty, as anything except what it actually was. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out because what could she say that wouldn't sound like begging these strangers to see her humanity, to acknowledge that poverty wasn't a moral failure? Mia's grip on her leg tightened, and Claire looked down to see her daughter's eyes had gone wide and scared, picking up on tensions she was too young to understand, but old enough to feel. The man's voice cut through again, quieter now, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "You were loud enough that a 4-year-old heard you call her mother inadequate. What part of that was honest assessment?" The first woman's expression shifted into something ugly, her mouth twisting as she looked the man up and down with obvious disgust. "I don't need life lessons from someone who probably can't even hold down a job, who needs special accommodations just to function in normal society." The cruelty had found a new target, and Claire watched it redirect like water, finding the path of least resistance, flowing from her toward this stranger who'd made himself vulnerable by defending her. She wanted to step forward, wanted to return the protection he'd offered, but her voice still wouldn't work, and her feet seemed nailed to the grocery store floor. Other shoppers had created a semicircle around them now, some pretending to shop while obviously listening, others just openly staring, and Claire felt the weight of all those eyes turning her humiliation into spectacle. "I'm a software engineer," the man said, and his voice had started to shake in a way that suggested he was running out of whatever reserves he'd been drawing from. "I work from home, I pay taxes, I volunteer at the library every Saturday teaching kids to code." Each fact delivered like armor he was trying to build around himself, proof of worthiness he shouldn't have to provide. And Claire recognized the desperation in it because she'd done the same thing countless times, listed her credentials to strangers as if human value required a resume. The second woman made a dismissive gesture, actually waved her hand like she was swatting away his words. "That's lovely for you, truly. But it doesn't change the fact that we live in a society where people need to take responsibility for their situations instead of expecting sympathy." She looked directly at Claire now, really looked at her for the first time, and Claire saw calculation in those eyes, saw this woman measuring her worth and finding it wanting. "I raised 3 children on my husband's salary. We never needed government assistance. We made sacrifices and smart choices." Claire's hands balled into fists because she'd heard this script before, this mythology that hard work and good choices were all that separated success from struggle, as if medical emergencies and layoffs and dead partners were just failures of planning. The man seemed to sense her rising anger because he shifted slightly, repositioning his cart in a way that kept him between Claire and the women, and she realized he was still trying to protect her, even as they redirected their cruelty toward him. "Your husband's salary," the man repeated slowly, and there was something new in his tone now, something almost like pity. "So you had a partner, shared expenses, backup income if something went wrong, and you're comparing that to a single parent trying to do everything alone." The observation was so obvious it should have been devastating, but the first woman just shrugged, unmoved by logic that contradicted her worldview. She made the choice to be a single parent, made the choice to have a child she clearly couldn't afford. The assumption hung in the air, toxic and familiar, and Claire felt something crack inside her chest because these strangers had written her entire story based on a grocery cart full of generic brands and decided she deserved her struggle. Mia made a small sound, almost a whimper, and Claire realized her grip on her daughter's hand had gone too tight. She loosened her fingers and took a breath that felt like swallowing glass, trying to find words in a moment where language seemed inadequate to the depth of what she was feeling. An older woman nearby had stopped even pretending to shop, was standing there with a package of cheese in her hands, staring at the scene with an expression Claire couldn't read. The fluorescent lights flickered once, and the produce mister kicked on somewhere behind them, and the grocery store soundtrack of music and beeping registers continued its indifferent melody. The man's shoulders had started to curl inward slightly, his body beginning to fold in on itself, and Claire recognized the posture of someone who'd hit their limit, who'd given everything they had and found it still wasn't enough. The first woman must have sensed victory, because her voice took on a satisfied edge as she said, "I think we've all said quite enough. Some of us have actual shopping to do, and children waiting at home who don't have to eat store brand because their mothers made better decisions." She started to turn away, dismissing them both with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never had to count pennies or fight for space in a world that didn't want them. But before she could take more than a step, a new voice joined the conversation, older and male, and carrying the kind of authority that came from years rather than money. Topic 4. The public humiliation. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice," the store manager said, appearing from the end of the aisle with a name tag that read Marcus and an expression of professional concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. The first woman turned toward him with visible relief, clearly expecting an ally, someone who would restore the natural order where people like her didn't have to justify their cruelty to people like Claire. Thank goodness, we were just trying to shop in peace when this man started harassing us, making us uncomfortable with his erratic behavior. The accusation flipped reality so cleanly that Claire felt dizzy, watched the manager's eyes move from the woman to the man still standing rigid beside his cart, and she saw the calculation happening in real time. The man's hands were shaking, his breathing audible, his whole body broadcasting distress in ways that could easily be misread as aggression if you wanted to misread them. And Claire realized with horror that the manager might actually side with the women who turned victim and victimizer inside out, with nothing but confidence and expensive clothes. "He wasn't harassing anyone," Claire heard herself say, her voice coming out stronger than she expected, surprising even herself. "They were making comments about my shopping, about my daughter, loud enough for everyone to hear, and he asked them to stop." The manager's attention shifted to her now, and Claire saw him take in her worn jacket, her generic cart, the little girl pressed against her side, and she watched his face do the same math the women had done, deciding what kind of person she was based on what she could afford. "I see," Marcus said in that tone customer service people use when they're trying to de-escalate without taking sides, which meant he was taking a side by not taking one. "Well, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding all around. Maybe we can all just continue our shopping and—" But the second woman interrupted him, her voice rising with indignation that seemed to feed on an audience. "A misunderstanding. This man admitted he's autistic, he's clearly having some kind of episode, and I don't feel safe with him blocking the aisle acting unpredictably." The word unpredictably landed like a weapon, coding the man's trembling hands and careful speech as danger rather than courage. And Claire saw something die in his expression. His eyes, which had been fixed on that invisible anchor point, dropped to the floor, and his shoulders curved further inward, like he was trying to make himself smaller, less threatening, less present. The manager shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, and Claire realized he was about to ask the man to leave, to remove the problem rather than address it. "He's the most predictable person here," Claire said louder now, her own hands shaking but her voice holding steady. "He defended me, used words, stood still, didn't touch anyone or threaten anyone, while these women have been verbally attacking a stranger and her child for buying affordable groceries." She felt Mia's arms wrap around her leg, felt her daughter's faith in her ability to fix this, and it gave her something to draw from that she thought she'd lost somewhere between the third job rejection and the shut-off notice on her electricity bill. The first woman's face flushed deep red, anger mixing with something that might have been embarrassment if she'd been capable of it. "How dare you? We were simply having a private conversation that you chose to eavesdrop on, and now you're trying to make us look like villains when all we did was speak truthfully about what we observed." She turned to the manager with an expression that demanded action. "Marcus, I've been shopping here for 15 years. My husband knows the owner, and I'm telling you right now that if you don't remove this situation, I'll be making a phone call that will affect your employment." The threat hung in the air like poison gas, spreading out to touch everyone in the aisle, and Claire saw the manager's jaw tighten with the reality of his position. He needed his job the same way she needed hers, was probably one bad month away from counting pennies himself, and the woman standing in front of him had just reminded everyone that some customers mattered more than others. The man's breathing had become rapid and shallow, panic written across his features in a language Claire was learning to read, and she realized he was going to break soon, going to flee or collapse, or do something these people would use as evidence that he'd been the problem all along. "Nobody needs to be removed," came another voice, and Claire turned to see the elderly man who'd been stocking shelves, the one who'd stopped to watch earlier, now walking toward them with the slow confidence of someone who'd outlived caring what people thought. He was maybe 70, with brown skin weathered by time, and eyes that had clearly seen enough of the world to recognize cruelty when it was happening 3 feet away. "I've worked here 26 years, since before you started shopping here, Janet, and I've watched you treat employees like furniture and other customers like obstacles every single Tuesday you grace us with your presence." The woman named Janet went pale, then red again, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find words that would reassert control. The old man, whose name tag said Miguel, didn't wait for her response. He looked at the manager with an expression that suggested he'd already decided his next words were worth whatever they might cost him. "This young man, Daniel, he comes in every Tuesday at 9:45, buys the same 12 items, arranges them in his cart the same way, and says please and thank you to every employee he encounters, which is more than I can say for most people in this store." Claire felt the shift in energy as Miguel spoke Daniel's name, giving the trembling man beside her an identity, a history, a pattern of kindness that contradicted everything Janet and her friend had tried to build. Daniel's head came up slightly, not enough to make eye contact, but enough to show he was listening, and Claire saw something like hope flicker across his features. Miguel turned his attention to Claire now, his eyes softening. "And I've seen you in here too, young lady, every week with your little one, using coupons, comparing prices, putting things back when they don't fit your budget, being patient and kind even when you're clearly exhausted." The testimony felt like oxygen after suffocation, like someone had finally seen her as human rather than evidence of failure, and Claire felt tears threatening to spill over despite her best efforts to hold them back. Mia looked up at her with wide eyes and whispered, "Don't cry, Mama," in that sweet voice that broke hearts with its innocence, and Claire nodded, swallowing hard against the emotion rising in her throat. Janet made a scoffing sound, trying to dismiss Miguel's words with the same casual cruelty she'd wielded all morning, but there were more people watching now, drawn by the commotion, and the balance of power had shifted in ways Claire could feel but not quite name. Daniel's hands released the cart suddenly, dropping to his sides like cut strings, and for a moment Claire thought he was going to walk away, going to abandon this confrontation the way she'd abandoned so many before it. But instead, he turned slightly, not toward Janet, but toward the small crowd that had gathered, his eyes still fixed on that invisible point somewhere in the middle distance that seemed to help him function in a world that demanded eye contact as proof of sincerity. His voice when he spoke was quieter than before, stripped of the steadiness he'd managed earlier, raw with the effort of pushing past whatever internal barriers were screaming at him to stop. "I practice conversations in my mirror every morning," he said, and the confession landed in the fluorescent-lit space like something precious and breakable. "I write scripts for interactions I might have, plan responses to questions people might ask, because spontaneous social situations feel like trying to read a language I almost understand, but never quite fluently." Janet made a sound that might have been impatience or disgust, but several of the gathered shoppers had gone very still, listening with an attention that felt different from the earlier spectator curiosity. Daniel's fingers twitched at his sides, wanting the anchor of the cart handle, but denying himself that comfort. "This morning I didn't have a script for watching someone be cruel to a stranger. I didn't have prepared words for confronting injustice. So, I'm doing this without a map, and it feels like drowning in air." His breathing hitched, and Claire saw him counting silently, lips moving around numbers only he could hear, pulling himself back from whatever edge he was approaching. "But I'm doing it anyway because Miguel is right. I come here every Tuesday, and I see things, I notice patterns, and one pattern I've noticed is that kindness is rare, and cruelty is easy, and most people choose easy." The second woman, whose name Claire still didn't know, shifted her weight uncomfortably, her earlier confidence faltering under the weight of Daniel's honesty. "We weren't being cruel, we were being realistic. There's a difference between honesty and cruelty, even if you can't distinguish between them." Her words tried to rebuild the wall Daniel was dismantling, but they sounded hollow now, defensive rather than authoritative, and Claire saw other shoppers exchanging glances that suggested they weren't buying what she was selling anymore. "I can distinguish perfectly," Daniel said, his voice gaining strength from some reserve Claire didn't know he possessed. "Cruelty is commenting on a stranger's groceries loud enough for them to hear. Honesty would be acknowledging that you don't know her story, but judged her anyway." He turned slightly more toward Claire, still not making eye contact but oriented in her direction in a way that felt intentional. "Honesty is admitting that seeing someone struggle makes you uncomfortable, so you blame them for the struggle, instead of examining a system that creates it." Janet's face had gone through several shades of red and settled on a color that suggested her blood pressure was reaching dangerous levels. "I don't have to stand here and be psychoanalyzed by someone who admitted he can't function normally in social situations. Your opinion about my character is meaningless because you're not equipped to judge normal human interaction." The words were designed to wound, and they did. Claire saw Daniel flinch as if he'd been physically struck, saw his hands ball into fists and then deliberately relax. A practiced motion that spoke of years learning to control responses people would use against him. "You're right," Daniel said quietly, and for a horrible second Claire thought he was conceding, was going to validate Janet's cruelty by accepting its premise. But then he continued, his voice steady again in that way that suggested he'd found his footing. "I can't function normally. I function differently, which means I see things from angles you don't see from. Notice details you filter out, patterns you miss because you're too comfortable in your assumptions." He looked at Miguel, really looked at him for a brief moment, and Claire saw gratitude pass between them without words. "Like the pattern of you leaving your cart in the checkout line to grab one more thing and making everyone behind you wait," Daniel continued, his gaze returning to its safe middle distance. "Or the pattern of you asking where items are instead of looking at the aisle signs because you assume employee time is less valuable than your effort. Or the pattern of you sampling grapes without paying, taking sips from the coffee bar without buying a cup, treating this store like your personal pantry where rules apply to other people." Each observation landed with the precision of someone who'd been cataloging behavior for weeks, maybe months, building evidence that contradicted everything Janet claimed to be. The silence that followed was different from earlier silences, heavy with the weight of undeniable truth observed by someone people had dismissed as unreliable. Janet's companion had gone pale. was looking at her friend with an expression that suggested she was seeing her clearly for maybe the first time. Marcus, the manager, stood frozen between competing pressures, his career on one side and his conscience on the other, and Claire could see him calculating which would cost more. The gathered shoppers had multiplied, drawn by the drama but staying now for something else, something that felt like witnessing a reckoning they'd been waiting for without knowing it. Daniel's whole body was trembling violently now, the effort of sustained confrontation and unscripted interaction clearly pushing him past sustainable limits. "I'm going to have a meltdown soon," he said with startling clinical detachment. "Probably in the next 5 to 10 minutes. My hands are shaking and my vision is tunneling and I can feel the overwhelm building like water behind a dam." He looked at Claire then, or at least toward her, his eyes landing somewhere near her shoulder. "But I need you to know before that happens that you're not inadequate, you're not failing. You're fighting a battle these women have never had to fight, and you're doing it with grace they'll never understand." The words broke something in Claire, shattered whatever remaining composure she'd been clinging to, and tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Mia made a small, concerned sound and pressed her rabbit into Claire's hand, that instinctive gesture children make when they want to share comfort. Janet seemed to sense the moment slipping entirely beyond her control and made one final attempt to reassert dominance. "This is ridiculous, Marcus. I'm calling corporate right now. You're going to lose your job over this, over protecting some unstable man and a woman who can't even feed her child properly." But before Marcus could respond, before anyone could respond, something unexpected happened that shifted everything again, pulled the confrontation in a direction none of them had anticipated. A woman Claire hadn't noticed before, standing at the edge of the gathered crowd with a toddler in her cart, stepped forward with her phone held up and pointed at Janet. "I've been recording this whole thing," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly across the dairy section. "Every word you said, every accusation you made, and I've already posted it to 3 social media platforms with your face clearly visible, so by all means, call corporate and explain why your shopping behavior is trending on Twitter right now." Topic 6. The breaking point. Janet's face drained of color so quickly, Claire thought she might actually faint right there in the dairy section, her hand flying to her throat in a gesture that looked theatrical, but was probably genuine panic. The woman with the phone didn't lower it, kept it trained on Janet with the calm determination of someone who'd witnessed too many injustices slip away into forgotten moments. "Actually, it's at 7,000 views already," she said, checking her screen with casual interest. "The comments are particularly interested in your threat to get Marcus fired for not removing an autistic man who was defending a single mother." The second woman grabbed Janet's arm, her earlier solidarity evaporating into self-preservation. "I need to go. My husband is expecting me. I wasn't part of any of this, really. I was just shopping and happened to be standing here when—" But the woman with the phone shifted her aim slightly, capturing the attempted escape. "You're in the video too, Susan, telling Claire she made the choice to be a poor single parent, suggesting Daniel was having an episode and making you feel unsafe." Susan's mouth worked soundlessly, trying to find words that would erase her participation in cruelty, now that it had consequences beyond the immediate moment. Daniel had sat down on the floor with his back against the refrigerated case, his knees pulled up to his chest and his hands pressed over his ears, the meltdown he'd predicted arriving with the precision he'd forecasted. Claire wanted to go to him but didn't know if touch would help or hurt, if her presence would be comfort or additional stimulation, pushing him further into overwhelm. Miguel moved instead, crouching beside Daniel with the ease of someone who'd done this before. Not touching, but positioning himself as a physical barrier between Daniel and the crowd, creating space and quiet through nothing but presence. "You can't just record people without consent," Janet said, her voice climbing toward hysteria, legal knowledge emerging from panic. "That's illegal. You're violating my privacy. I could sue you for—" The woman with the phone laughed, an actual, genuine laugh that held no humor. Colorado is a one-party consent state for recording conversations, and even if it wasn't, you're in a public space having a loud conversation you wanted everyone to hear. She looked at Marcus, who was still frozen in management purgatory. You might want to call your district manager now, because this is going to hit local news by tonight, and corporate will want to know what happened before angry people start calling. Claire felt the ground shifting under social physics she was only beginning to understand, watching power redistribute itself in real time as evidence and witness replaced he said, she said ambiguity. Other shoppers were pulling out their own phones now, some recording, others clearly texting or posting, and she realized the grocery store had become a stage where accountability was being performed by an audience that had decided which side of history they wanted to stand on. Mia tugged on her jacket. "Is the nice man okay?" she asked, looking at Daniel rocking slightly against the dairy case, and Claire's heart cracked at her daughter's concern for a stranger who'd protected them. "He will be," Claire said, hoping it was true, watching Miguel speak softly to Daniel in words she couldn't hear but could read in the older man's body language. Calm and steady and patient. Susan had abandoned Janet entirely, was pushing her cart toward the checkout lanes with desperate speed, her expensive coat flapping behind her like she was fleeing a crime scene. Which she was, Claire supposed, just not the kind that involved police or courts, the social kind where reputation died in comment sections and shared videos, where cruelty had consequences beyond the immediate victims. Janet seemed to realize she was standing alone, her ally gone, and the crowd's sympathies firmly against her, and something in her face changed from anger to something more complex, fear maybe, or recognition that she'd miscalculated badly. "I didn't mean," she started, but the woman with the phone cut her off. "Yes, you did. That's the whole problem. You meant every word, and you only regret it now because someone was recording." Janet's eyes swept across the watching faces, looking for sympathy or at least neutral ground, and found neither. Marcus finally moved, seemed to shake himself out of paralysis and into decision. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the store," he said to Janet, his voice carrying the weight of a choice that might cost him his job, but apparently mattered more than keeping it. "We don't tolerate harassment of customers or employees, and based on what I've heard from Miguel and other witnesses, you've created a hostile environment." Janet's mouth fell open, shock written across her features like she'd been slapped by reality itself, and Claire felt a savage satisfaction she wasn't proud of, but couldn't deny. "You're choosing them over me," Janet said, her voice breaking on the words, pointing at Claire and Daniel and Miguel like they were a collective affront to natural order. "Over a customer who's spent thousands of dollars here over 15 years? You're choosing a man having a breakdown on your floor and a woman on food stamps?" The assumption about food stamps made Claire's jaw clench, because Janet couldn't imagine any other explanation for poverty, couldn't conceive of medical debt or dead partners or jobs that paid minimum wage, could only understand struggle through the lens of moral failure. "I'm choosing witnesses and video evidence over someone making threats and harassing vulnerable people," Marcus said, and Claire heard his hands shaking even if she couldn't see them. "And for the record, Daniel is one of our most respectful customers, and Claire has never been anything but kind to staff, which is more than I can say for you, even before today's incident." The gathered crowd made sounds of agreement, that collective murmur of an audience that had picked its protagonist and villain and wanted the story to resolve accordingly. Janet looked around one more time, searching for rescue that wasn't coming, and Claire saw the exact moment she realized she'd lost completely. Her shoulders sagged, and her expensive purse slipped down her arm, and for just a second she looked old and tired and human, in a way she hadn't before. But then pride reasserted itself, or maybe just habit, and she drew herself up straight. "Fine. I wouldn't shop at a store that treats loyal customers this way anyway. You'll be hearing from my lawyer and from corporate and from everyone I know who—" She stopped because even she could hear how empty the threats sounded now, how powerless she'd become in a situation where social proof mattered more than money. She left then, not quite running but moving faster than dignity allowed, and the crowd parted for her like water around a stone, everyone careful not to let her pass too close. The woman with the phone kept recording until Janet disappeared through the automatic doors, then lowered her device and looked at Claire. "Are you okay?" she asked, and the question was so simple and direct after everything that had happened that Claire almost laughed. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and looked down at Mia, who was still pressed against her leg, rabbit clutched tight, trying to make sense of adult interactions that probably seemed like storms she couldn't predict or understand. Daniel's rocking had slowed to almost nothing, his hands still pressed over his ears, but his breathing evening out into something closer to normal rhythm. Miguel remained crouched beside him, a silent anchor in the aftermath of chaos, and Claire saw the older man check his watch with the patience of someone who understood that recovery had its own timeline that couldn't be rushed. The crowd was dispersing slowly, shoppers returning to their mundane missions with something to tell their families over dinner, and Claire felt the grocery store trying to reassemble itself into ordinary Tuesday morning normalcy, even though nothing felt ordinary anymore. Marcus approached her carefully like she might bolt if he moved too quickly, and Claire realized she was still shaking, adrenaline draining from her system and leaving exhaustion in its wake. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," he said, and she could see he meant it, could see the weight of management decisions and corporate pressure written in the lines around his eyes. "Your groceries today are on us. It's the least we can do after—" He gestured vaguely at the space where confrontation had happened, unable or unwilling to name it more specifically. "You don't have to do that," Claire said automatically, the words coming from years of refusing help even when she desperately needed it, pride being the last thing poverty hadn't taken from her. But Marcus shook his head firmly. "Yes, I do actually. Because if I don't, then corporate is going to ask why I kicked out a long-time customer over something I didn't try to resolve with compensation, and I need the paperwork to show I took your experience seriously." The honesty was refreshing, acknowledging that even kindness had bureaucratic justifications, and Claire found herself nodding acceptance because arguing would just make everyone's day harder. The woman with the phone had put it away finally, was organizing her toddler back into proper cart-sitting position with the distracted efficiency of practiced motherhood. She caught Claire's eye and smiled, a real smile that carried solidarity. "I have 3 videos from 3 angles because I texted my sister and my best friend while it was happening, told them to watch my live stream and screen record everything." She pulled a business card from her purse, handed it to Claire. "I'm a lawyer. Family law mostly, and if you ever need representation for anything, custody, housing, employment discrimination, call me and we'll work out payment you can actually afford." Claire took the card with hands that had finally stopped trembling, looked at the name printed there, Jennifer Alvarez, attorney at law, and felt something shift in her understanding of how help could arrive. Not from social workers or government programs or charity organizations with their forms and requirements and judgment disguised as assistance, but from a stranger in a grocery store who'd seen injustice and decided to document it. "Thank you," Claire managed, the words feeling insufficient but being all she had, and Jennifer squeezed her shoulder briefly before continuing toward checkout with her toddler singing nonsense songs about dinosaurs. Miguel stood up slowly, his knees cracking audibly, and reached down to help Daniel to his feet with practiced care. Daniel leaned against the dairy case for a moment longer, his eyes closed, before accepting Miguel's offered hand and pulling himself upright. He looked wrung out, exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness, and Claire recognized the expression from her own mirror on bad days, when surviving had taken everything and left nothing for living. "I need to go home," Daniel said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just stating fact, and Miguel nodded like he'd expected nothing less. "Let me walk you to your car," Miguel offered, and Daniel shook his head in a movement that looked automatic, rehearsed from a lifetime of refusing accommodation. "I take the bus. It comes in 18 minutes. I'll be fine once I'm outside where there's more space." He looked toward Claire then, or toward her general direction, his eyes landing somewhere near her collarbone. "I'm sorry I couldn't finish. I wanted to stay until they actually apologized, but my body had other plans. Sometimes it just shuts down when there's too much input, and I can't override it, no matter how important the situation is." The apology twisted something in Claire's chest, because he was saying sorry for having limits, for being human, for not being able to sustain superhuman effort indefinitely. "You did more than finish," she told him, meaning it with every atom of her being. "You did something I've never seen anyone do. You stood up when you didn't have to. You made yourself vulnerable to defend a stranger, and you did it knowing it would cost you something." Her voice cracked on the last words, because she was thinking about cost, about how Daniel had spent something precious and finite to protect her and Mia, had used up reserves he'd need for the rest of his day and possibly week. Daniel's mouth quirked in something not quite a smile, but close. "My therapist is going to be very interested in this session. I've been working on spontaneous confrontation skills for 2 years, and apparently grocery stores are where I finally break through." The attempt at humor felt like a gift, like he was trying to lighten the weight of what had happened, and Claire found herself almost laughing, despite tears still wet on her cheeks. Mia chose that moment to step forward, still clutching her rabbit, and held it up toward Daniel with the solemn ceremony children bring to important rituals. "You can hold Mr. Hops for a minute if you want," she offered, her voice carrying that particular 4-year-old confidence that believes stuffed animals fix everything. "He makes me feel better when I'm sad. Maybe he'll make you feel better too." Daniel looked at the rabbit, really looked at it for several seconds, taking in the missing eye and repaired ear and the love visible in every worn patch of fur. He reached out slowly, took the offered toy with careful hands, and held it against his chest like it was made of something more precious than fabric and stuffing. "Thank you, Mia," he said, his voice gentler than it had been all morning, and Claire saw her daughter beam with pride at having helped the nice man who'd helped them. Daniel held the rabbit for maybe 30 seconds, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deliberate, before handing it back with the same careful reverence. "Mr. Hops is very good at his job," he told Mia seriously, and she nodded agreement like they'd just concluded important business. Miguel watched the exchange with an expression Claire couldn't quite read, something between sadness and hope. And she wondered what he'd seen in his 26 years working in this store. How many small cruelties and smaller kindnesses had played out in these fluorescent aisles. Daniel was gathering his cart, preparing to leave his 12 items behind and escape to the bus stop, where predictable schedules and minimal human interaction awaited, when the automatic doors opened and Susan walked back in. Not walked exactly, more like drifted. Her earlier purposeful stride replaced by something hesitant and unsteady, and Claire felt her whole body tense with the expectation of round 2. But Susan's face had changed, the smug superiority stripped away to reveal something raw underneath, and her eyes were red in a way that suggested she'd been crying in her car before deciding to return. She stopped several feet away, maintaining distance like she understood she'd forfeited the right to proximity, and her hands twisted together in front of her expensive coat with nervous energy that looked nothing like the confident woman who'd mocked Claire's groceries 20 minutes earlier. "I need to," she started, then stopped, her voice cracking around words that seemed to be fighting their way out against significant resistance. Miguel straightened slightly, positioning himself where he could intercede if necessary, and Marcus appeared from nowhere looking professionally concerned about potential Scene 2. "My daughter Hannah hasn't spoken to me in 3 years, Susan said abruptly, the words tumbling out like they'd been held back too long under too much pressure. Not since her college graduation, when I told her that her girlfriend was just a phase she'd outgrow if she tried harder, that living authentically was fine for other people, but our family had standards to maintain. Her voice broke completely on the word standards, and Claire saw her visibly struggling to continue, saw tears starting to track through carefully applied makeup that was smudging into something tragic. She told me I was the cruelest person she'd ever known, that I hid my cruelty behind concern and propriety and standards, that I'd spent her whole life making her feel not good enough while pretending it was for her own good. Susan's hands had moved to her face, covering her eyes like she could hide from her own confession. And I told her she was being dramatic, that she'd understand when she was older, that sometimes love looks like tough honesty. The grocery store had gone quiet again, a different kind of quiet than before, witnesses to something more intimate than confrontation. She hasn't returned my calls in 1,095 days, Susan continued, her voice dropping to barely above whisper. I know because I count them every single morning. I wake up and add another day to the total of my daughter not wanting me in her life. She lowered her hands and looked directly at Claire for the first time with actual eye contact, with the vulnerability of someone who'd run out of protective armor. And watching you with your daughter just now, watching her offer comfort without being asked, watching you accept help without shame, I saw everything I taught Hannah not to be. Claire felt the moment stretching out, felt the weight of being given something she hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with. Susan's pain offered up like payment for crimes that couldn't be purchased back. Mia pressed closer, sensing tension she couldn't name, and Claire's hand found her daughter's head, fingers threading through soft hair in that instinctive gesture mothers make when the world feels uncertain. I don't know what you want me to say, Claire said finally, because she didn't, because Susan's broken relationship with her daughter wasn't something Claire could fix or forgive or make meaning from. I don't want you to say anything, Susan replied, tears flowing freely now, mascara painting dark tracks down her cheeks. I want you to know that you're a good mother, that I saw genuine love between you and Mia, that my cruelty came from recognizing everything I've lost because I chose judgment over acceptance. She looked at Daniel, who'd gone very still, his cart abandoned between them. And I want you to know that I was wrong, that your autism doesn't make you less capable of understanding human interaction. It makes you capable of understanding it more honestly than people like me who hide behind social performance. Daniel's hands had found the cart handle again, gripping it with that precise placement Claire now recognized as grounding technique. People say things they don't mean when they're defensive, he said quietly, offering her an escape route, a way to reframe cruelty as temporary aberration rather than character truth. But Susan shook her head violently, rejecting the kindness. No, I meant it when I said it, that's the problem. I've spent decades meaning cruel things and calling it honesty, and it cost me my daughter, and it's turning me into someone I don't recognize in mirrors anymore. Murmured. The confession hung in the air like smoke, visible and choking, and Claire realized they were all witnessing something that wasn't really about them. Susan's breakdown, using them as mirrors to reflect back truths she'd been avoiding. Miguel moved slightly closer to Susan, not quite touching but present, and his voice when he spoke carried the weight of experience. My son stopped calling me for 2 years once, after I told him his art degree was a waste of money and he needed to get a real job. He paused, letting the admission settle. Took me 18 months to understand that loving someone means supporting who they are, not who you need them to be for your comfort. How did you fix it? Susan asked, desperate for roadmap, for instruction manual on repairing what seemed irreparably broken, and Miguel's expression softened with something like pity. I apologized, really apologized without any but or justification, and then I spent 4 years proving I meant it by showing up differently. He looked at Susan with the directness of someone delivering hard truth. But you can't fix it to get something back. Can't apologize. As transaction expecting forgiveness as payment, you fix it because being the person who broke your child's trust is intolerable, regardless of whether they ever trust you again. Susan nodded slowly, processing wisdom that probably tasted like ash, and Claire watched this woman who'd attacked her transform into something more complicated than villain, into someone who'd spent years building walls around her own fear and called it standards. "I'm sorry," Susan said, looking at Claire and then Daniel and then Mia, her voice stripped of everything except exhaustion. "I'm sorry for what I said, for how I said it, for being the kind of person who finds other people's struggle threatening enough to attack." She didn't wait for response, didn't seem to expect absolution, just turned and walked back toward the doors with her shoulders curved inward like she was carrying weight that had suddenly become visible. Topic 9. A simple act of kindness. Claire stood frozen in the aftermath of Susan's departure, her cart still half full of generic brands and good intentions, her daughter still pressed against her leg like a small anchor to reality. The fluorescent lights continued their indifferent buzz, and somewhere 3 aisles over, someone dropped a jar that shattered with percussive finality, ordinary disaster, in an ordinary store on a Tuesday that had become anything but ordinary. Daniel was organizing his 12 items back into precise arrangement, his hands moving with methodical care that suggested he was rebuilding his sense of order, one can of soup at a time. "Wait," Miguel said, holding up one weathered hand, and both Claire and Daniel paused mid-motion like children called back from recess. The old man walked toward the customer service desk with purposeful stride, disappeared behind the counter for a moment, then returned carrying a small envelope that looked worn from handling. "We have a fund," he explained, his voice carrying that matter-of-fact tone people use when discussing miracles they've decided to treat as mundane. "Started it myself about 8 years ago after watching a veteran try to buy formula with coins. Every employee who wants to contributes a few dollars from each paycheck." He held the envelope out to Claire, and she stared at it like it might contain something dangerous, something that would obligate her in ways she couldn't afford. "There's about $200 in here right now," Miguel continued, pressing it into her resistant hands. "It's for customers who need it. No forms, no judgment, no repayment expected, just people helping people, because that's what grocery stores used to be before they became corporate machines optimizing profit margins." His eyes held hers with an intensity that demanded she accept, that refused to let her refuse, and Claire felt something crack in her chest that had been holding tight for so long she'd forgotten it was clenched. "I can't," she whispered, but her fingers had already closed around the envelope, betraying her protests with desperate need that lived deeper than pride. Miguel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face into something younger. "You can and you will. And someday, when you're on the other side of struggling, you'll put money back in the envelope for whoever needs it next." He said it like prophecy, like he could see futures Claire couldn't imagine from her current vantage point of counting pennies and generic cereal, and she wanted to believe him badly enough that it hurt somewhere behind her sternum. Mia was looking up at her with those enormous eyes children have before the world teaches them to hide their feelings, and Claire saw her daughter processing adult transactions that involved money and shame and kindness in combinations 4-year-olds shouldn't have to pass. "Can we get the rabbit cereal now?" Mia asked with the hopeful pragmatism of children who understand instinctively when circumstances have shifted in their favor. And Claire laughed, actually laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuine joy, despite tears still wet on her face. "Yes, baby, we can get the rabbit cereal," Claire said, and watched Mia's face transform into pure delight, that uncomplicated happiness only possible before people learn to guard their enthusiasms. Daniel had finished arranging his cart and was pulling something from his jacket pocket with careful deliberation, a small square of paper that he unfolded with practiced precision. Claire watched him smooth the creases, revealing an origami crane made from what looked like magazine paper, colors bright against white wings, and she realized he carried these with him, had made them before arriving at the store, or maybe made them constantly as his hand's way of thinking. He held the crane out toward Mia with that same careful reverence he'd shown when accepting her rabbit earlier. The gesture completing some kind of exchange Claire was only beginning to understand. "This is for you," he said softly, "for being brave, while your mom was being brave, for understanding that sometimes adults need comfort too." Mia took the crane with both hands, cradling it like it was alive, like Daniel had given her something more precious than paper and folds, and Claire felt her throat close around words that wouldn't come. "I make them when I'm anxious," Daniel explained, not quite looking at either of them. "My therapist taught me, said it gives my hands something to do that's productive instead of destructive, that creates beauty instead of picking at skin until it bleeds." The confession was offered casually, but landed heavy, another piece of vulnerability from someone who'd already given so much. "I have about 50 at home in different colors. I make them while I watch television or listen to audiobooks. And I give them away to people who seem like they need portable reminders that broken things can be refolded into something that flies." Claire's vision blurred with tears she'd been fighting all morning, finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in this fluorescent-lit space where strangers had revealed themselves as both worse and better than she'd imagined possible. "Thank you," she managed, the words encompassing the crane and the defense and the vulnerability and the existence of people like Daniel who functioned differently but loved just as deeply. Mia was examining the crane with intense concentration, tracing the folds with one careful finger, and Claire saw her daughter learning something about kindness that no amount of her mothering alone could have taught. Marcus reappeared carrying a shopping basket filled with items Claire hadn't selected, setting it in her cart with the embarrassed efficiency of someone performing kindness under surveillance. "Some of the other shoppers wanted to contribute," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Fresh fruit, the name brand cereal, obviously, diapers, some things you had in your cart but put back earlier." Claire looked down at the basket and saw evidence of strangers watching her shop, tracking her decisions about what she could afford versus what she needed, and felt invasion and gratitude war for dominance in her chest. "3 different people added things after you weren't looking," Miguel added, his voice carrying approval. "The woman with twins in the produce section, the college kid who works overnight stocking, the retired teacher who always buys flowers for her wife's grave." He gestured at the basket like it contained more than groceries, like it held proof that humans still remembered how to care for each other in small, unglamorous ways. This is what happens when people remember grocery stores are community spaces, not just retail transactions where everyone pretends they're shopping alone. 6 months dissolved like sugar in water, individual days blending into the steady rhythm of Tuesday mornings that transformed from ordeal into ritual. Claire arrived at the grocery store at 9:30 now, 30 minutes before Daniel's precise 9:45 entrance, wearing the navy vest that marked her as employee rather than customer, her name tag catching fluorescent light as she restocked shelves beside Miguel, who'd become more mentor than co-worker. The store manager position had opened after Marcus took a corporate job 2 states away, and Miguel had recommended her with the kind of certainty that made the district manager's doubts seem small and conquerable. She'd used Jennifer's legal services twice, once to navigate a predatory lease situation and once to file paperwork establishing sole custody when Mia's father resurfaced, demanding rights he'd abandoned years earlier. Jennifer charged $30 total, called it the friends and family rate, and when Claire protested the absurdly low fee, Jennifer had smiled and said the viral video of Janet's humiliation had brought her 17 new clients. So really, Claire had already paid through social media publicity. The logic was questionable, but the kindness was real. And Claire had learned slowly to accept help without attaching shame to need. Mia started pre-kindergarten at a program Claire could finally afford with her new salary and the envelope money she'd carefully budgeted across 3 months of groceries and co-pays and car repairs. The rabbit cereal remained a weekly tradition, no longer a luxury requiring justification, but just another item in a cart that now held name brands mixed with generic choices based on preference rather than desperation. Mia still carried Mr. Hops everywhere, but she'd added Daniel's origami crane to her collection of precious things, keeping it on her nightstand where she could see it before sleeping and upon waking. Daniel arrived at exactly 9:45, as he had every Tuesday for 7 years, his cart containing the same 12 items arranged in their familiar pattern. But now he paused at the employee break room first, where Claire and Miguel waited with coffee that had become ceremonial. They didn't talk much during these 15-minute interludes, just existed in companionable silence that Daniel had explained once was the most valuable gift anyone could give him. Presence without performance requirements. Sometimes Mia was there, coloring at the break room table before Claire's shift started, and she'd show Daniel her artwork with the unself-conscious pride of children who hadn't learned to doubt their creations yet. Susan came in occasionally, always on Tuesdays, though never at 9:45, shopping quickly with her head down like she was trying to minimize her footprint in a space where she'd once demanded everyone's attention. She'd joined a support group for parents of LGBTQ children, information Miguel shared after she'd asked him for resources one afternoon while crying in the cereal aisle. Her daughter Hannah hadn't responded to letters yet, might never respond, but Susan showed up every week to the group and volunteered at the local Pride Center, and was apparently learning that repair work happened in actions, not words, in showing up differently even when no one was watching to give credit. The video of the confrontation had accumulated over 2 million views across various platforms, spawned think pieces about ableism and classism and the casual cruelty of privilege, made Janet briefly infamous in ways that apparently cost her both her country club membership and several friendships. Claire had watched it exactly once, 2 weeks after it happened, and felt strange seeing herself from outside, small and afraid, but still standing, still present for her daughter, even when everything in her wanted to flee. Jennifer kept the video active despite Janet's lawyer threatening legal action, said it served educational purpose, and Claire supposed she was right, even if being viral educational content wasn't a role she'd ever imagined filling. Marcus sent Claire a card when he heard about her promotion, wrote that he'd been thinking about the dairy section confrontation every day since, how it had clarified what mattered versus what was merely convenient. He'd quit corporate after 3 months and opened a non-profit focused on employment services for people with developmental disabilities, was apparently thriving in work that aligned with values he'd discovered he possessed when forced to choose between his conscience and someone else's money. Claire had the card pinned to her small apartment's refrigerator next to Mia's finger paintings and a photo from her first day wearing the navy vest. The store itself felt different now, or maybe Claire just saw it differently, noticed things she'd been too exhausted to register before. The way Miguel knew regular customers by name and preference, remembered the veteran bought low-sodium soup because of heart problems, knew the elderly Korean woman preferred jasmine rice from the specific brand on the bottom shelf. The employee fund grew steadily, fueled by staff who understood poverty from personal experience and customers who'd heard the story and wanted to contribute to something that worked without bureaucracy. They'd helped 11 families so far, amounts ranging from $50 for diapers to $300 for someone's water bill, miracles measured in survival rather than salvation. Daniel's Thursday coding classes at the library had expanded to include an adult session he taught on Tuesday evenings, designed specifically for people who found traditional classroom environments overwhelming. Claire had attended twice, bringing Mia, who colored quietly, while adults learned programming fundamentals in a room where stimming was normalized and eye contact was optional. Daniel was a patient teacher, explained concepts through metaphor and repetition without condescension, and Claire watched him transform from the trembling man on the grocery store floor into someone fully present in his element, sharing skills with the same generous vulnerability he'd shown defending strangers 6 months ago. She put money back in the employee envelope last week, $40 from her first full paycheck after expenses were covered, and savings account had something in it besides theoretical intentions. Miguel had watched her do it with that quiet approval he specialized in, hadn't said anything because nothing needed saying, just the act itself completing the circle he'd predicted. Claire thought about the veteran buying formula with coins, about her own hands shaking while counting pennies, about the distance between those moments measured not just in months, but in the accumulated small kindnesses that built staircases out of desperation. Tuesday morning light streamed through the grocery store windows at 9:47, catching on Miguel's silver hair as he laughed at something Daniel said about the absurdity of banana inventory systems. Mia sat in the break room, finishing a picture of 3 figures she'd labeled in 4-year-old spelling as Mormor and Daniel and Miguel, her family expanding to include the people who'd stood between her mother and cruelty on an ordinary Tuesday that became extraordinary. Claire poured coffee into 3 mugs and thought about ripples, how Susan showing up to volunteer, and Marcus starting his non-profit, and Jennifer taking on clients she'd never have met, were all waves from that moment in the dairy section when one man's courage made space for everyone else's. The automatic doors opened, and a young mother entered with a toddler in her cart, both looking tired in that specific way Claire recognized immediately, the exhaustion of choosing between needs when resources only covered half of them. The woman's cart held generic everything and her hands moved with practiced speed comparing prices, mental math Claire knew by heart. Miguel caught Claire's eye, tilted his head toward the woman in silent question, and Claire nodded because this was what they did now, what the grocery store had become under their small revolution. A place where people looked after each other, not because it was policy, but because they'd learned cruelty has consequences and kindness has possibilities that ripple outward further than anyone can measure on ordinary Tuesday mornings when strangers remember how to be human. If you've ever been judged for counting pennies, if you've ever felt invisible in your struggle, if someone's small act of courage changed everything for you, then you know why Claire and Daniel's story matters. If this touched your heart, subscribe for more stories about everyday people choosing kindness over cruelty, and drop a comment sharing a time someone stood up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself. Because your story matters too, and together we prove that compassion is contagious.